FM. And I'm just not delaying really because I wanted to bring in our first guest. I'm delighted to be joined by Cian O'Callaghan TD and Social Democrat Spokesperson for Housing. A lot of people have been hearing in the media about the notion of the government providing up to 144,000 of a subsidy to builders, and that's just in the context of apartments. Very welcome to the show. Good morning to you, Cian.
Good morning.
This idea of supporting developers, where has this all come out of?
So, firstly, I don't agree with this idea. It's come out of, there is an issue with the construction costs of apartments. Developers and their lobbyists say it's not viable to build apartments. Now, this is something that they've been saying over a number of years, and they've achieved a number of changes that are beneficial from their point of view over the last few years. And they've achieved reductions in the standards of apartments, which they said would bring down the cost to make apartments more affordable. But since then, the prices have actually gone up. And they've said that because, apartments aren't viable, they needed these build-to-rent schemes again with a lower set of standards again. And that's actually seen, less and less apartments built for people to be able to buy. Most that are getting built in cities are just going to build to rent, and investment funds at very high and exorbitant rents at that. So that's crowding out anyone looking to buy apartments. So that's the rationale that's been given for this. But I don't accept it, to be honest, which is one of the things I've been asking about is what level of developers' profit will be subsidised in this. And developers generally say that they need at least a 15% profit to build an apartment, and I don't accept that should be subsidised by public money, hard-earned money from the public. And also what this scheme is doing is it's really taking away a lot of the risk for developers. So, to some degree they can justify a high profit margin if they have a lot of risk, but if the risk has been taken away from them, then, why they should be entitled to high profit levels, I don't understand.
Just bearing, if I'm to interpret you correctly, what you're basically saying by way of summary, obviously that you don't agree with this, and that goes without saying, but that to make apartments a viable option for developers to get involved in, they need a financial incentive which the government are prepared to give them with no clawbacks and no strings attached, and a substantial one at that by the looks of it. The idea that it will level out prices, that makes no sense to me either, I have to say, because if we remember back to the time where there was the first time buyers grant, got me with the days, and all it did really was just add to the cost on the property as far as the developer was concerned. So, what is the alternative, do you think?
Well, I think there's a good few alternatives on this. So, for example, the state could, and there is a significant amount of planning permissions for apartments in cities that aren't built out. So the state could, at a fraction of the cost of the subsidy, could buy out those sites with the planning permissions and could seek to get those built out, let's say, by a not-for-profit housing association. And one of the advantages of that is not only would you not have to be contributing to the cost of the 15% profit margin, but also not-for-profit housing associations, or if it was a local authority or state involved as well, can actually borrow at much lower interest rates because they're considered a lower risk provider. And the Housing Finance Agency provide that finance. So not only would you be reducing in terms of the profit margins, you'd also be reducing in terms of the financing costs. Apartments, typically an apartment that a developer says costs, let's say €400,000 to build and bring to the market, less than half of those costs will actually be the building costs, including the materials, construction materials and the labour costs. So less than 200,000 of that would be actually building the apartment and the structure, the shared spaces and that. The other more than half of the costs are their financing costs, and their profit costs, professional fees. It's all those soft costs and the levies that they have to pay as well. So there is actually, there's nothing I think that can be done in terms of or very little that can be done in terms of significant costs in terms of the actual build costs. But the other half is where we should be seeking to reduce costs and actually make housing and apartments much more affordable for people.
In the context of state-owned land, if you take a situation where you have developers who already own stretches of land that they haven't built on, I mean, how does the state get involved in taking over stretches like that? That's not a straightforward process legally, sure it's not, because 9 times out of 10 the developers will have bank loans over those properties as well.
Yeah, but I'm just saying one of the ways of, rather than a subsidy of up to €144,000 per apartment, the land costs per apartment would be somewhere in the region of about €40,000 per apartment. So if the state was really keen to see these built out, it could say, well, look, here's €40,000 per apartment. We'll buy out the site at that cost, rather than giving a much larger subsidy, and then you could try and deliver the homes at a much more affordable rate. I mean, there is a small amount of affordable homes being built around the country by the likes of O'Callaghan, who are a not-for-profit housing association, and they are coming in at much better costs. And they're the same quality now as a private developer, and in fact they're built using private, builders and smaller builders. But because they're able to finance it at a much better rate, and because they're not taking a profit, they're able to come in at a much better rate. So they're building, 3-bed houses in areas like in Cork and North County Dublin, North West.
I suppose
€250,000-260,000.
I hear exactly what you're saying. I suppose what I would say in the context of developers, though, I mean, at the end of the day, they regard themselves as entrepreneurs. I mean, we're focusing on affordable housing here, and the idea that we can create as much housing as possible at an affordable price for people who really need to get onto the ladder for houses. I mean, there is a market out there that is not about affordable housing. Obviously, we know that. Are you saying that developers shouldn't really be looking to those sorts of markets and should be focusing more on affordable housing?
No, I mean, I think absolutely where developers can build, themselves and off their own initiative, and can provide for people who can afford higher prices, let them away at it. No issue with that at all. I absolutely have an issue with €450 million of public money being used to subsidise apartments for what will be for the top 14% of income. And that's analysis done by Cian Woods in the Business Post was showing this scheme is going to provide apartments for that top 14% of Irish households. Now that shouldn't be subsidised by everybody else. And I mean, we all know people are going through a huge cost of living crisis at the moment, struggling in terms of heating their homes, putting food on the table, and the idea that their money is being used to subsidise profits for developers to provide apartments for the highest income groups. I mean, that's absolutely outrageous. So absolutely let private developers off to do that. But the idea that the state will come in and take away the risk and guarantee their profits for that venture, I think is completely unjustifiable.
I mean, even as we're saying it, it just doesn't sit well in the context of any degree of equality or fairness out there, particularly when you look at mortgage holders who are, being taken to task by lenders if they even default on 1 or 2 months in terms of repayments. Where has this come from? I mean, I've asked you this already, but are we talking about a state-driven policy here? Have developers got some sort of inside track onto government policy?
Yeah, I've asked about this quite a bit, and I didn't get any answers from the Minister for Housing on this. Now, I did get a bit of an answer, in fairness, from the Taoiseach in the Dáil yesterday, and his reply was no, developers weren't looking for this. Said that they would have favoured tax incentives and some sort of tax breaks. And that they weren't looking for these cash subsidies. And there was something, the Minister for Housing at the Rockford Housing Committee last week also kind of said, look, we can't do tax incentives, implied that those had added badly in the past, and they were really drove a lot of speculative development that led to the crash that we had at the Celtic Tiger. But it seems like, so I don't know for certain. It does seem to me that there was maybe, lobbying for tax incentives or something like that, and the government pushed back about that and said, but here's cash subsidies instead. Now that to me doesn't make any sense, because
I know
the damage that tax incentives can do, you can almost multiply that in terms of cash subsidies. And
yeah.
It's the same principle of throwing money at an area. We need, investing in an area is absolutely the right thing to do, but we need to be very careful about how we do it, make sure it's cost effective, look at what consequences it could have. I've been asking about this. Has there been any kind of economic evaluation, cost benefit analysis? And again, can't get any answers, straight answers on that, except as far as I can tell, there hasn't been any of that. And so they haven't even looked at how this will affect land prices of these sites. And I've been talking to people who have expertise in this area, and they say, well, look, when a developer when they're approved for, let's say, €2 million in subsidies for their apartment scheme, they will then be able to sell that site at 2 million or the guts of €2 million more than they would have yesterday when they're not approved for those subsidies. So they're saying we'll push up land prices.
Well, that's the problem.
That will have an inflationary effect on the prices of apartments.
That's where it just doesn't make any sense for anybody who's listening and trying to understand the logic of it all. Cian, thank you so much for your time. We've kept you a while. I know you're a busy man. I appreciate it, and we'll chat again. Keep up all the good work. Take care.
Thanks
You're
very
welcome.
Much.
Bye now.
Bye.
Cian O'Callaghan there, TD for the Social Democrats and spokesperson on housing. I know, some people just don't understand any of this, but for those of you who are following it, the idea of a no strings attached financial incentive per apartment of 144,000 to a developer, with no onus to reduce the price accordingly when it goes for sale. So in other words, it's not that it's going to guarantee that it will be affordable for anybody. How on earth does that make any sense in terms of policy?